everyone. I'm Tim Baldermann, the mayor of New Lenox. I want to thank you all for coming out here tonight to this forum on property tax freezes, some proposed legislation. Seated up here is Dr. Jeremy Groves from Northern Illinois University. He'll be making a presentation tonight. Patrick Sweeney, the president of the Union School District 81 Board of Education. Mayor Frank Fleischer from the Village of Mokina. Bob Bruce, the business manager from District 122. Dr. Peggy Manville, the superintendent of District 122, and Dr. Scott Tingley, the superintendent of Lincoln Way 210. So I want to say thank you to Dr. Tingley and to the Lincoln Way Board of Education and all of the staff that did a nice job of setting this up here and agreeing to host this forum tonight. So we will get started. After a technical
All right. I don't know if that helps or not, but is that it? There you go, Annette. I'll have to bend down, so we'll go. All right. So, to the displeasure of some people that I know, I'm sure, tonight's presentation is called The State of Illinois, Smoke and Mirrors and the Art of Deception. It seems a little harsh, but the reality is that what the legislation that's being proposed down in Springfield, that's exactly what's happening. So some of this proposed legislation deals with property tax freeze. So when we've talked to the governor and to state legislators about why would you freeze property taxes when you know it's going to have a tremendous impact on local taxing bodies and it does absolutely nothing to help your state budget, they said, well, it polls at 90%. And the first question I asked were, well, who were the 10% who said they didn't want their property taxes to freeze? When you ask a question like that, of course people are going to say property taxes are high, we don't want them to go any higher, we'd like to see them lowered, but if you certainly can freeze them, that would be great. But any talk of a budget deal has included a property tax freeze, and the freeze has been discussed to be anywhere from 2 years to permanent. The way that the governor has proposed it is if the legislature wants a 2-year increase in income taxes, he'll agree to a 2-year property tax freeze. If the legislature wants to increase the income tax permanently, then he wants a permanent property tax freeze. And again, with the state's financial condition, freezing property taxes does nothing. The state of Illinois has not received property taxes to their budget since 1932. So it has no impact on the $11 billion hole that they have, the $11 million a day further into debt hole that they're digging. And by the end of the next governor's election in 2018, whoever the governor is that takes office in January of 19, they're looking at somewhere from $22 to $24 billion in the hole if they don't resolve this crisis. How did we get here? Well, Illinois ranks last in state funding for public education. You can see we are 50th in the country, even though there is a constitutional mandate, an obligation, that Illinois fund the majority of public education. So even at that basic form, that's 50.1%. Now, this number says that we are close to 20% funded in Illinois public education, K through 12. The national average is 45%. So obviously, where's the funding going to come from if the state isn't doing their job? It's going to come from the local property taxes. And you'll get a great explanation of how that works. But just imagine what would happen if the state was fulfilling their obligation. In this particular room, the districts that are represented here today, the state is funding anywhere from 7% to 13%. So nowhere near the 50% that they should be funding. So I'm going to come back after Dr. Groves gives a little overview of property taxes and PTEL. Dr. Jeremy Groves is the Associate Professor and Director of Graduate Studies at Northern Illinois University. He obtained his MA and PhD from Washington University in St. Louis in 2005. You can see the areas of research: homeowners association, absentee landlords using GIS and economic research, property taxation and housing markets. And his areas of specialization, the reason we have him here today, public finance, urban and regional economics. Unfortunately, he is a Cardinals fan. That's the only thing he's not very bright on, but we will allow him to come up and talk about his areas of expertise, so please welcome Dr. Gross.
So thank you for that. Yeah, this year's been a hard year for me as a Cardinals fan. In enemy territory for so long, and then, well, we all know what happened. Okay, so what I've been asked to speak about is property taxes in general, and basically how they work, and to look at what is the savings versus the costs of this proposal that's being put forth in Springfield. Now, the subtitle of this is kind of freeze or hypothermia, and hopefully I'll be able to explain why I give it that. The first thing I want to do, though, is in my discussions with individuals and so forth, I find out that the property tax is one of the most misunderstood taxes that we have. And there's very good reason for that. It's the most complicated tax that we have. It also happens to be one of the most hated taxes that we have, nationally speaking. So what I'm going to start out with doing is basically explain where does that property tax number come from, okay? Now, how it starts is you have a community or a district that has a boundary. And inside of that district or boundary, you have houses. And what they do is they calculate the market price for these houses. And there's a variety of different ways that they do this, but this is the assessor's job. And then once they estimate what the market value of your house is, they divide that number by 3. Because the state of Illinois has what's called an assessment ratio of 33 1/3%, which says that your assessment, what is taxed of your property, is 1/3. So if you've got a house, for example, that's $100,000, your assessment value is going to be $33,000. That's what's going to be taxed, right? So once we have all of these assessments, so everybody's house has been assessed now, what they're going to do is they're going to add all of those assessed values up, right? So we've got the assessed values for each of our 4 houses here in our example. We're going to add those up. That is what is called the equalized assessed value. This is a term you've probably heard. That is essentially what we're going to spread the property tax across. And this differs for different districts because it depends on what houses are in what districts. Every district has their own equalized assessed value, okay? So now that we have the equalized assessed value, we know what, this is like if you go to Target to buy a TV, this is the price of the TV, okay? Now, how do we figure out the tax? Well, the next thing we need is a tax rate, okay? Well, what makes the property tax so unusual is the rate fluctuates. It's not set like a sales tax rate is. What determines that rate is 2 things. The first thing is what we call the levy, okay? This is basically when your school district or your city or your park district or your fire district sits down and says, okay, we have this money coming in from grants, we have this money coming in from the state, we have this money coming in from another source, that's what we've got, this is what we need, you subtract the 2, that's our hole that we have to fill with property tax revenue. So this is what we need from the property tax, is the levy. And then what they do is they send that levy in to the county or the township assessor. The township assessor takes that levy and divides it by that equalized assessed value. So basically what they're going to do is they're going to spread out that levy across the entire value of property inside that district. That's how they come up with the rate. Okay? So that number on your property tax, you'll usually see it as something like this, 3.75 or 0.1984. That's what we call the tax rate. okay? Now, once we have that rate for a given district, so the school district has its own rate, the park district has its own rate, everybody has their own rate because they all have different levies, they need different amounts, and they all have different assessed values, right? Once we have that, we apply that rate to every single assessed value inside that district's property lines, right? So we're going to apply our 3.75 rate here to the assessed values. That's going to give us what's called the extension, okay? The extension is the actual dollar amount that you pay that district on your property tax, okay? If you add up all of the extensions inside of a district's boundary, you should equal the levy, which is exactly what that district needs, okay? So when you calculate these taxes and we look at the property tax, this is what, for example, a new Linux, this was a property tax bill sent to me by the mayor here, and this is what it looks like. You've got your list of districts here. So these are all the districts that are charging a property tax. In this case, you have their 2014 rate. Here's the 2015 rate. These rates were all calculated by taking everyone's assessed value underneath the levy that each of these districts needed. That gives us this number here. Multiply this by the assessed value of their house. The market value is listed for this particular property is $318,000. Divide that by 3. That'll give you the assessed value. Take that number, multiply it by 0.1937, you'll get $193. Okay? Everybody gets a property tax bill that looks like this. Okay? Now, what this means is, with your property tax, I like to make the comparison to a sales tax, right? The sales tax is very simple. You go into the store, you buy something, you take the price, you multiply it by the fixed sales tax rate, you have your tax, right? The property tax, or if the sales tax is going to change, the sale price, the price of the item changes, or the rate changes. That's it, right? Rate doesn't change very often, so as long as if the good fluctuates in price, you know what your tax is going to be. You can't do that with the property tax because there's actually 3 things that determine what your individual property tax is going to be. It's going to be the levy. What does the district need? It's going to be the assessed value. How has property behaved inside of that district? Has it become more valuable? Has it become less valuable? Has there been new construction? Right? And those 2 are going to calculate the rate, and then it matters what your assessed value is. What has your property done? Right? And how those impact your property tax rate is if the district levy goes up, everything else stays the same, then the property tax rate is going to go up. If the levy goes down, the property tax rate will go down. If the equalized value goes up and everything else stays the same, your property tax is actually going to get smaller because there's more things, there's more value to spread that property tax over. If the value gets smaller or does not grow, then that's going to have the adverse effect on your property taxes. If your value changes, your house becomes more valuable, everything else stays the same, your property tax rate is going to go up. Your house becomes less valuable, everything else stays the same, your property tax rate will go down. So there are so many moving parts to the property tax that it's hard to pin down one thing as being able to say, if this changes, this is what's going to happen to the property tax, right? That's what's difficult about the property tax, and that's why it's so confusing and why it is one of the most hated taxes, because it's not very transparent how it's calculated, right? Now, in this particular case, we're dealing with the growth of property taxes in the state of Illinois, which has a habit of having large property taxes. This has actually been dealt with by the state under what they call the Patel Law. The Patel Law stands for Property Tax Extension Limitation Law. Remember the extension. The extension was when I take that rate and I multiply it by your assessed value, and I got the dollar amount that you owed that district, that's your extension. The Patel Law was originally basically stuck on all of you guys as a collar county. It automatically was applied to every single Collier County in 93, I think, 93 or 94. Subsequently, Cook County has been included. As for the other counties in the state of Illinois, they can vote to become a part of this. They can choose to and have a referendum. If it passes, then they're subject to the law. If it doesn't pass, they're not subject to the law. But all of the Collier counties, by definition, are subject to this law. The only, well, first let me say what the law says. That extension, that dollar amount that you pay, cannot go up by the lesser of 5% or the CPI, right? So that dollar amount, the school district can't just pick a new dollar amount willy-nilly. If that dollar amount is more than inflation as measured by the CPI, too bad. You don't get it. You can only increase according to the CPI. I'm saying the CPI because if you go back and you look at the history, inflation has not been anywhere near 5% for a very long time. Best case scenario, you're looking at about 1.5% to a 2% increase in extension that's even possible every single year, right? That's the law that's on the books. Now, there are exceptions. You can have a referendum. Your school district can say, look, we need more money because of X. Will you please let us raise the extension by more than inflation? And as a voter, you can say yes or no. The other thing is not all funds are subject to the Patel. A district can have more than one fund, and we'll come back to this in a second. What's usually popular to do in this case is to have a fund for operations and a fund for pension. Pension funds, not subject to Patel. Bond funds, not subject to this law. Okay? Home rule municipalities. If you're a home rule municipality, you do not have to, you're not subject to this. Right? Those are the only exceptions. Okay? That's the law that's on the books. What's being proposed by Springfield is to take that law and modify it for either the years 2017, 2018, or from now until the end of time. If they modify it, they're going to redefine such that everybody is subject to this. It doesn't matter if you're home rule, it doesn't matter if you're a school district, everybody is subject. That 5% or the CPI rule, we're going to change that to 0. There can be absolutely no growth in the extension, period. With a couple of exceptions. You can go and ask your voters to allow you to increase it more than 0%, okay? Or certain funds will not be subject to the 0%. Those funds will be subject to the inflation rule. And those funds are bond funds, pension funds, and public safety, okay? Now, here's one of the problems with this that may not necessarily be, or there's actually two problems that may not necessarily be directly apparent. One, inflation is real, and inflation is not 0%. There's no rule for inflation in this. So as your school district's food costs go up, there's no allowance for that here. They don't get to increase their costs because it's 0. Not 0 or inflation, it's 0. The other thing is, if you buy a new house, the first year you generally do not pay a very large property tax bill because it's a brand new house. It has not been assessed yet. Guess what? Your extension is, let's say, 0. This law says your extension cannot increase. So guess what it's going to be next year? 0. And the year after that, 0. So if this passes, everybody go buy a new house. It doesn't include new construction. What does that mean? Those new houses are never getting added into that equalized assessed value, right? If they were to add those numbers in, then it could potentially lower your burden on your property taxes. This rule is not going to allow cities and districts to capture that new construction. It's also not going to be able to capture an increase in value, right? If your house goes up, it doesn't matter, right? We can't capture that in this case. So directly, what we like to do in economics is look at what are the direct impacts and what are the unintended consequences of this, right? So the direct impact is property tax bills will stay mostly constant. There's going to be some changes because we've got those funds that aren't subject to this, right? But that also means operation revenues are going to stay constant. School districts, fire districts, park districts, they get no more money. Their money, their income is frozen, right? Well, what does this mean? What are the implications of this? Well, these are just the ones I could come up with, but in the short run, you're going to look at one of two things. These districts are either going to cut programs because they have to balance their budgets, or they're going to borrow more money. Now, I'm not going to speak for anybody up here, but the economist in me says, well, okay, I could cut things, which is unpopular, or I could borrow, and if you remember, bond funds aren't subject to the 0% increase. So I'm going to borrow. But if I borrow more money, what does that mean? That means I'm going to have to start paying more interest. So from a property tax perspective, from the house owner's perspective, this is actually worse for you, right? It locks away any new revenue from growth. So what's the incentive to grow? We don't get to capture any of that revenue. It's locked away. The other thing that we do here, and this has actually happened, I talked to a colleague of mine, and I won't say where it happened, but in this particular place, they used to pay pensions out of, they just had one district fund for the city, and it was operations. That was it. And they paid pensions out of it. When they found out this was floating around, this idea, they created multiple funds. So they made it even more complex, the property tax, because the pension funds aren't subject to this limit, or at least not the 0% limit. So you also may see an incentive for districts to spin off new funds, right? What about the long run? Well, the long run effects are going to be these losses, even if it's a 2-year freeze. Let's just assume it's a 2-year freeze, okay? The losses in those 2 years are going to compound themselves from now until the end of time. Especially for school districts, park districts, and so forth, because they're subject to the Patel law. They can never increase their extension more than inflation. So they can never recapture that lost revenue. And when they do get to increase their extension, the number that they get to base that inflation increase on is now smaller because there's 2 years worth of growth that's missing. And so every time they do get to increase it, they're increasing a smaller number. Right? It's like if you had $100 in a bank account and I gave you 10% interest, and I originally promised to give you $100 a year to increase that even further, and then just said, well, I'm not just going to give it to you for 2 years. You're going to have less money compounding itself in the future. Large extension increases for things that aren't subject to Patel. If I'm a district and I'm not subject to Patel, fine, freeze my district, freeze my property taxes for 2 years. But in 2 years, guess what, guys? You're all going to see a huge extension because I'm going to get that money back. Because I have to operate. Right? That's just how the incentives are going to be set up. So your property taxes may not change for 2 years, but they're going to change big time in 3 years. Right? Because why would they leave the money on the table? So what I was asked to do, and I'll finish with this real quick, I know I've been pondering on a bit here, is to calculate the savings versus the costs. Right? And so what I did, I'm not going to go too much into this, it's up here, you can see it, feel free to ask questions later about how I did this, but I projected out what you would pay in property taxes if growth continued the way it's been going in this area and nothing was passed in Springfield, versus what you would save if we actually did the freeze. Okay? So the first one I'm looking at is New Lenox, the village of New Lenox, right? And what I've got here is if you have a $150,000 house or a $300,000 house. If you have a $300,000 house, the first year of the freeze, you're going to save $4.30 on your property tax. Don't spend it all in one place. The village of New Lenox will lose $105,000. Right? Over 5 years, you'll save $40. Right? So maybe a dinner for two. New Lenox loses $1 million. Because you got to remember that $40 is spread out to you. 40 bucks, not so big deal. $40 per person to New Lenox is a big number, right? What about the E22 school, 122 school district? In 2017, you'll save $15 on your property tax bill. The school district will lose $1.2 million. Over 5 years, you'll save $270. That's a nice chunk of change, right? The school district loses $13 million. And remember, this money is lost, it's gone. They can't claw that back, it's gone. Right? Now they could borrow it, I suppose, but there's a problem when you borrow money. You end up paying back more than you borrowed, right? So this is gonna be even more expensive. The high school, 210 district here. First year, you're gonna save $34. The district is gonna lose $1.3 million. In 5 years, you'll save $300. The district loses $11 million. What I did here was just add them up for all 3 districts. So in 5 years, if we were to freeze property taxes, you would save approximately $750 for just these 3 districts. Okay? Okay, that's not too bad. Good amount of money. The districts lose $26.1 million. You save maybe 2%, the district loses 4%. And so what you have to do as a voter is you have to weigh the benefits and the costs of that. Is your saving $700, is it worth the district losing $26 million? Because the thing that you have to realize is the quality of your schools, the quality of your parks, the quality of your fire districts, that feeds into the value of your house. And if they're making $26 million worth of cuts, you're going to get fewer services. That's going to decrease the value of your house. I can show you all kinds of research that shows that, right? In the 2 years of just the tax freeze, you save $250, the district loses $8.1 million. And so really what it boils down to, and I'll finish on this, is that savings worth the cost? And I'll reiterate that, again, the state, as the mayor commented on, the state does not receive property taxes, okay? And I'll go a little off script here just to kind of back up some of the numbers that he gave you. I have done my own looking at this because I've been in discussions with people arguing about what about the neighboring states? They have lower property taxes, and they do. The neighboring states, the average state funding is about 46% for schools. The state of Illinois the average is 20%. If you break it down into individual districts, most of that funding, of that 20%, is in Cook County. If you break it down into the other districts, it's less than 20%. So where do schools get their money? The only source they have available to them. Other states, I used to live in Indiana, part of our income tax would go to the county and would go to the county school district from the income tax. Missouri can't really make a one-to-one comparison there because they have a higher income tax and they have personal property tax. We don't do that. So it's easy to compare these numbers and compare just the property tax number to surrounding states. But you have to take everything into account when you make that comparison. And hopefully, as just kind of an unbiased individual here, hopefully, the numbers you were given are right on track with what we observe in the actual historic data. Okay? So hopefully I didn't bore you too much and you learned something about property taxes, and I'll turn it back over to the mayor for now.
Thank you, Dr. Groves. That was wonderful. Well, bad news, but it was a great presentation. You know, I have just a few more slides, but the reason we're doing this is not only as the mayors of the communities, but the school board members and the superintendents, we feel we have an obligation to let you know exactly what will happen if this proposed legislation moves forward. And again, in my conversations, I was just in Springfield last week, speaking with leadership, they said, well, that's what the people want. Well, people need to understand exactly what that means. Now, I will speak just from the village's perspective. We've run a balanced budget for a long time. We give back 75% of our property taxes, the village's portion, to our residents, which came out to about $1.3 million this year. I can assure you that we're not going to cut services. Our primary responsibility is providing services. So the average taxpayer in New Lenox may get back a check for $250 on their property tax rebate. Well, we're going to take whatever money we lose directly out of that rebate. So if you were saving $100 a year on your property taxes and you live in New Lenox, now you're going to save a little less, because we're not going to fire police officers or not buy road salt. We're going to take it back from this benefit that we like to give to our people. The park districts in all of our communities have great relationships with the schools. The grade school districts and the high school districts do a wonderful job of, at a very minimal cost, allowing the park districts to use their facilities on the weekends for programs. Well, if the park districts lose money, they're going to have to increase the fees. And if the schools lose money, in order to keep their doors open on the weekends, they're going to have to increase what they're charging the park district. So now all of a sudden, if you have any kids that participate in any of the park district programs, there goes more of this supposed savings that you're going to get. And it goes on and on and on, because we have to operate. As Dr. Grove said, the levy, we're talking about 2%, just trying to keep up with inflationary costs, whether those are personnel costs or their supply costs or whatever they are. Under PTEL, that's what we're subjected to. So now, as a home rule unit in New Lenox, we made a promise when we became home rule that we would not extend beyond that. And we have kept that promise for 8 years. Even though we were not subject to those caps, we kept to CPI anyway, because that was a promise that we made. Well, I don't know that we're going to be able to continue to do that if this property tax freeze happens, especially if they talk about permanently. So we are here today to just do our job to make you aware of exactly what's being proposed out there. Now, I asked all of the feeder schools into 210 to give me some information, because I knew we would have residents from the entire area. Every feeder school was asked to provide information if they chose to, and they gave it in different forms. So you've already seen 122's information, you've seen 210's information, you've seen the Village of New Lenox's information. Here's the Manhattan School District. The most likely scenario, if there's a 2-year property tax freeze and they're not able to access any new money, Manhattan, over a 5-year period of time, is going to lose $4.7 million. Frankfurt, 157C, just on the first 2 years, they didn't extend it out to the 5 years, but they're going to lose $1.2 million over the 2 years. Summit Hill School District, their aggregate loss over 5 years is $6.5 million. Union School District, over 5 years, nearly $1 million. Mokina School District, their 2-year property tax freeze, $731,000. So what's the solution? Well, we get elected locally to make decisions here for our communities, for our school districts, for our park districts, our fire protection districts. We're the ones who should be making those decisions. Everyone talks about local control. If you don't like what we're doing, we've got elections and you can handle it accordingly. So what we don't like is that the state's coming in and telling us how things should be done, when it has absolutely no bearing on their budget. So it's not for us as local officials to tell the state what to do, but we can tell you that in order for them to correct this massive hole that they have built over decades of waste and inefficiency, they're going to have to make some tough cuts. They're talking about raising income tax. They're talking about raising service taxes. They're talking about even possibly retirement taxes. So why are they talking about property taxes if it doesn't impact them? Why? That's the art of distraction. That's the smoke and mirrors. That's, hey, we've got to raise all of these taxes on you to dig ourselves out of this massive hole. But please don't look at that. Look what we're doing for you over here by saving you $100 on your $300,000 house. But look at the cost of that $100. That's the only reason that this is being proposed. So what are some of the solutions? Well, the income tax was at 5%. It was decreased back to 3.75. They gain $1 billion in revenue for every 0.25% that the income tax goes up. That's where they come up with this $5 billion figure if they go back to the 5%. Of course, they're not proposing that. They're proposing 4.99999 because you don't know the difference between that and 5%. Adopting a graduated rate income tax. That's something that's not popular, but as we said, there are only 8 states in Illinois that don't have that, or 8 states in the United States that don't have a graduated income tax. So that brings in billions of dollars. Now, it requires a constitutional amendment, but it brings in billions of dollars if they base this more on income tax as opposed to property tax. The little bit more that you'll pay in income tax, you'll save tremendously in property tax. Expanding the sales tax, as I said, is something that they're talking about. Ending corporate loopholes and subsidies. Less than 1/3 of Illinois corporations paid income tax to the state. Less than 1/3. And there's an example. ConAgra, their annual revenue was $18 billion and they're getting a tax break. And then pensions are a major part of this, but it has to be constitutionally allowable pension reform. There are things that have to happen in order for, and there are changes that need to be made, there's no doubt about it, but they have to propose something that's going to hold muster in the courts. What can you do? You came out here today, you're paying attention, we're asking you to tell your neighbors and friends, and then if you agree with our presentation here today, we're asking you to call your state senator, call your state representative, call the governor's office, and tell them you want property tax relief, but it has to be done the right way. Again, we're all paying high property taxes, but the majority of the people that I speak to in the Lincoln Way area say the same thing that I said when I moved out here in 1994. I'm moving out here for the schools. I'm going to pay a little more in taxes because I want my kids to get a good education. I'm going to pay a little more because I want them to live in a safe community. I was one of the many people that came from Cook County and just coming south. And I'm thrilled that I made that decision. Am I happy with the property taxes that I pay? No, I'm not. Would I like some relief? Of course I would. But I have 5 children that have received a tremendous education at 122 and here at 210. We live in a safe community, and I'm willing to pay a little bit more for it. My property tax relief should come from the state doing their job, and there are some other factors. There are some consolidation things that can happen. We have 7,000 layers of government in Illinois. 7,000. That's more than any other state. Now, you can't just say, well, all the feeder schools should consolidate into 210. That doesn't work. It really does not work. But there are areas of consolidation that you can do that will save people. But in a patronage state, nobody likes to do that. No one likes to move forward. We've given some good examples here of where we share services to save taxpayers' money. That needs to happen more and more and on a higher level. So what we're going to do now is open the floor. If there's any questions, we've got microphones here. This is going to be televised in the local community so people can hear. So if you're not too shy and you have any questions, we would ask that you come forward, and any one of us would be happy to answer. Anyone? Go ahead, please, step up to the microphone so everybody could hear. We've got one, and then, yes.
Years ago, there was never a problem. When the school district wanted a referendum or wanted a tax increase, it passed. There wasn't even a question, no question. And then all of a sudden, people started looking around and saying, what the heck's going on here with the state, the federal government, local governments? At least our local governments were ran good. Now everybody is just tearing the money, taking the money, and I don't know what they do with it. But there's not a pension fund, there's not a school district that is run properly anymore. There's not a fire district, there's not a county. They're all so far in the red, I don't know if they'll ever get out of it.
Okay. Well, thank you.
That's why we need a property tax freeze. We need this freeze for 2 years. They can go and they can look at it and say, you know what? Maybe we'll give you that 1.5 the gentleman was talking earlier, and that's all you're going to get. But that's it, because you got to get your books in order, and you got to show the people that are paying these taxes that you're willing to change whatever you're doing wrong, whatever the whole county, state, and feds are doing wrong. Everybody's, I don't know where the money's going, but it's not right.
Okay.
And that's why we need a property tax freeze. I don't care about the $40 or the $700. I just look at the bottom line of what our money is going for and how crooked and how bad it's being spent. That's what we look at.
Okay.
Period.
All right, well, I certainly...
And I don't see any change. I don't see any change state-wise, federal-wise, county-wise. They just want, well, we need more money.
Well, you're certainly entitled to your opinion. I would tell you that we can point to a number of examples where local government in particular is running well, where a lot of districts are running well. Hold on a second. I let you speak. There are also examples of where it's not. So I would tell you that without question, that's where people need to be engaged, and they need to be involved, and they need to pay attention to who is running, who's running for office, who's in these offices, and if they feel like there's a problem, attend a board meeting and go to the election. But when we're talking about the services that are provided and the money that is provided, I think there are a number of examples of good, efficient government that are being run. And of course, there are some where there's not.
I am engaged. I always look at who's running for office. And if I don't know the person, I have people that I ask.
Sure.
Unfortunately, I'm not going to name names.
Sure.
A few of those people that I voted for are either in jail or kicked out of office.
Sure. There's definitely some bad examples. We can't argue with that.
And you're right. There are some agencies that are run well in the county, let's say.
Yes.
But that doesn't justify the ones that are not being ran well. And to get everybody in line, we need a property tax freeze. Simple as that. Not for indefinite.
Yep.
Not for 2 years, 4 years, but we need a freeze. And here's the deal. You say, well, the state doesn't get the money for the property. You're right, they don't get the money. All they want is to freeze our property taxes so that they can raise all those other taxes. Well, the state shouldn't be able to raise their taxes either on anything because they're just stealing it as fast as everybody else. All right?
Okay.
Matter of fact, I think they're stealing it faster.
All right.
And as far as Crook County, not Cook County, Crook County, and that's...
Go ahead. I'm going to let you go ahead. I'll let you finish
County,
quickly. Yeah, that's why we're here.
They are the most corrupt bunch of morons that live.
Okay.
And a lot of people that moved out of here from Crook County, moved out here to Will County, unfortunately, they bring their ideological ideas with them. They run away from taxes. They run away from whatever they're getting out. They bring it right out here to Will County, and what do? They do the same BS.
All right, sir. Thank you. No, I appreciate you were here. Let me tell you something. Go ahead. You can have a seat. Thank you. Here's the point. He's frustrated, and he has a right to be frustrated. I think we're all frustrated. There's no doubt about it. But we need to look at why this is happening and how do we address it. But thank you for being here and for your comments. Go ahead.
Hi. limited view. Being a senior, I have different values or different things I need to look at.
Sure.
Fully 72% of my property tax are going to schools. I cost you guys zero. I have no kids, no grandkids that go to our districts. It is my obligation to make sure the youth of today is educated. You guys do a great job of that. Prior boards, there was some mismanagement. I won't go into details. You all know what I'm talking about. Millions of dollars thrown away. You talk about contacting your state senator. I've attempted that. Pretty much no interest. He's blaming all the state's issues on a governor that's been in for 2 years, and nothing's going to change unless we move to Chicago and vote Madigan out of office, because that's just the way it's going to be. So how do you overcome this? I don't have good answers. I just know that right now they're talking about taxing retirement income.
That's right.
You're going to see the state lose probably every single one of the seniors that can afford to move. I'm here because I like New Lenox. The area is great, close to everything. I've been here 12 years. I've seen my taxes go from $4,500 to $6,500 in that period of time.
Sure.
Okay, I could do that because I do it because I love the area. The pension reform ain't going to happen without a constitutional convention. It just ain't going to happen. I don't see that under the present leadership in the state. Reach out to Senator Hastings. Tell him what your feelings are. You probably won't reply. I know he won't have a town hall meeting because it just won't happen under his watch, as it were. And it just is not conceivable to me to continue to raise taxes, live within your means, be tougher on your negotiations with your employees. Biggest kick of that is if this pension thing doesn't get changed, it's going to fall back onto the districts. It will. And that means we, as citizens, are going to have to pay that $179 billion debt that was caused by the Democrats that are presently in office in the state of Illinois. I'm not a Republican. I'm independent. I vote Democrat federally, Republican locally, because the two are at odds right now. Totally different concepts on how this country and state should be run.
Okay.
And again, it's just a matter of just can't afford it anymore.
You're
Just
absolutely
can't.
right. No, I appreciate you being here. I appreciate your comments, and I would hope that's the very last thing that they look at is taxing retirement income. Now, they claim that if they look at that, it's going to be for $50,000 or more. So I don't know, but that should be the very last thing because it is difficult for seniors. There's no question. Those on a fixed income have a hard time being able to make it with the current tax system, the current property tax system. Thank you. Well, here, it's very simple. There are still, thank you, there are still people who are trying to get a deal done. Many of us have been around long enough in dealing with Springfield to know that, at first it was an all or nothing proposition. That doesn't mean that's how it's going to stay. And so, but all conversations that I've had with legislators that I'm very confident in and those that I'm not very confident in have all said if there are any deals struck that will have a property tax freeze tied to that. So there has been no conversation about this component not being a part of it. Now, there's also some belief that there's a good chance we're going to go 2 more years without a budget, which means that then the state will be $22, $24 billion in the hole, which is no good. But, so it's dead, but there have been things that have happened at midnight, and you wake up in the morning and something was passed. So the whole point of this is to say a property tax freeze is going to be a part of any budget that is passed. We just want the communities to be aware of what this means. Now, you can sit here and watch this presentation, and I don't mean you, but someone could sit here and watch that presentation and say, fine, go ahead, freeze it. I'd rather have my $100 a year or $200 a year, and you'll all have to make do. Well, that's fine. People are entitled to their opinions, but I think it's our obligation to let everyone know exactly what it means. So that's the information that I have. And I did speak with President Cullerton, with the governor's chief of staff, and with the chief of staff for Mike Madigan as well. So, okay, thank you. Any other questions? Okay. Okay, thank you. Anyone want to talk about that? Bob? Peggy? Go ahead, Bob.
So the 1% sales tax is the facility sales tax, where if the majority of school districts pass a resolution to ask to put that on the ballot, we can get that put on a future ballot where the voters would have to vote to approve that for the county of Will. And the way that would work is it could be 0.25%, 0.5%, up to 1% at the most. And that sales tax, and it's on certain goods and items, it's not everything, so there's details, what's included in that, what's not included in that. But that would be a good help for school districts, because one of our biggest expenses is keeping our older buildings maintained and updated, and that sales tax is specifically set for maintaining buildings. You have to keep that money on the side and not spend it on anything else. So, and the documentation we have from 2012, which was the last time this initiative was kind of out, being voted on by school boards, the New Lenox School District, specifically 122, could have received up to almost like $2 million a year from that. So $2 million a year to our budget would certainly help take care of all of our buildings. It would certainly help us not have to sell bonds in the future to help renovate buildings, and it really would help keep our budgets efficient and keep property taxes as low as possible. So we have had discussions over the last this school year again, determining what steps do we need to take to get that type of question out to the voters so they can decide if that's a good idea or not.
Very good. And along those lines, that was our philosophy in New Lenox when we looked at home rule by adding an additional sales tax, but we rebate on the property tax, because we agree with that. So now 80% of that money comes from outside New Lenox on a sales tax, but 100% of it goes back to the residents of our community. It is an antiquated system that everything is being paid by property taxes, and people are being taxed out of their homes. So whether or not there's an appetite for all of the school boards to want to see that question put on the ballot for the people to decide, I mean, my personal feeling is that the voters should be able to decide something like that. So, okay, thank you. Anyone else have a question? Anything? Okay. Well, again, I want to thank Dr. Tingley and Lincoln Way and the Board of Education for allowing us to be here. Certainly to all of our panel members, especially Dr. Groves for making the long trip out here and putting the presentation on. And for all of you, I know you're all busy in your lives, for making some time to come out here. Thank you for doing that. It shows that you're engaged and concerned, and we ask that you spread the word, and hopefully we can let Springfield know where we stand. Thank you for coming out. Good night.